It was a bright, crisp morning in New York City, the kind where the sky looked like it was painted in shades of blue that could only exist on the highest canvas. The air was buzzing with the kind of energy that only the heart of Manhattan could produce. But today, something felt different. As the bustling streets hummed with the usual chaos, inside the studio of The View, something was brewing, something that would change everything. Whoopi Goldberg, the seasoned host with a career spanning decades, a woman whose voice had often commanded attention, whose opinions were as sharp as they were respected, had been abruptly removed from the show. No, it wasn't a sick day. It wasn't a temporary leave. She was gone, and the world outside had no idea why. Fans were left with unanswered questions. Why? What happened? Where did Whoopi go? The social media feeds flooded with speculation, gossip, and the occasional conspiracy theory. It was as if a missing piece of the puzzle had been taken away, leaving only confusion and curiosity in its wake. Whoopi had been a staple on The View for years. Her wit, her humor, her sometimes controversial opinions. She was a voice that millions had come to trust, love, and, occasionally, debate. And yet, there she was, absent from the screen. The producers were tight-lipped. The other hosts were scrambling, trying to maintain the calm facade of the show, while the tension behind the scenes grew thicker by the minute. What happened next would shake the world of television. It would challenge everything viewers thought they knew about their beloved daytime talk show and about Whoopi herself. This was the beginning of a story that no one saw coming. A story that would take twists and turns, unraveling secrets, betrayal, and a deeper mystery that no one had ever anticipated. The stage was set, the lights were shining, and Whoopi's sudden departure was only the beginning of what would be a shocking, unforgettable journey. Would the truth ever come to light? Or was something darker at play? Keep watching, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The phone rang at Whoopi's apartment, its shrill sound slicing through the silence. Whoopi sat in her favorite armchair, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands, the steam rising like a whisper of comfort. It had been a quiet morning, perhaps too quiet. She hadn't expected anything unusual, not after the whirlwind that was last week's episode of The View. But now, as she glanced at the caller ID, her heart skipped. It was the show's producer, Maria. Whoopi hesitated before picking up, a familiar, gnawing unease creeping into her stomach. Maria was usually calm, composed, but there was something in her tone that made Whoopi's instincts flare. "Whoopi," Maria's voice crackled with a touch of tension. "We need to talk." Something about the urgency in Maria's voice made Whoopi sit up straighter. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice betraying a flicker of worry. "Whoopi, we've made a decision," Maria started, hesitating for a moment as though weighing each word. "It's time we take a break from you being on the show for a while. It's not working." The words hit Whoopi like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean it's not working?" Her voice cracked slightly, the weight of the statement suffocating her. A break? From The View? The show had been her second family for years. The women on that set weren't just co-workers. They were sisters, confidants, sparring partners. This wasn't just a professional issue. It was personal. Maria's voice softened. "It's a lot of factors. Don't take it personally. You know how these things are. It's just time." Whoopi's mind raced. Time. She'd heard whispers about tension behind the scenes, but it had never been this direct. She could feel the room closing in on her. Her hands trembled, the coffee cup now a forgotten accessory in her grasp. "What's really going on, Maria? Who's behind this?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line, but Whoopi could feel the hesitation even without seeing Maria's face. Finally, Maria spoke in a hushed tone. "We don't want to make this public yet, but there are other people involved. People higher up. People who think it's time for a change. I'm sorry, Whoopi." And with that, the phone call ended, leaving Whoopi in a storm of emotions. Betrayal, confusion, fear, and, above all, disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her mind screamed for answers, but they felt too far out of reach. The studio had always been her home, her sanctuary, a place where she could be herself. Now, it felt more like a prison of secrets. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest, but she couldn't just let it go. She had to find out what was really happening. Who were these other people? And what had changed so drastically to push her out? Her world, her career was on the edge of collapse, and she was ready to fight back. In the days that followed, Whoopi couldn't shake the sense of dread that gnawed at her. She had always prided herself on being able to read between the lines, but this time, she was blindsided. The truth seemed just beyond her grasp, slipping through her fingers like sand. The call from Maria had been the catalyst, but now she was on her own, navigating a world where everyone, even the people closest to her, seemed to be holding their cards too close to their chests. She tried reaching out to her co-hosts, Joy, Sunny, Sarah. Surely one of them would give her an honest answer, but each time, she was met with vague statements and uncomfortable silences. "We don't know what's going on," Joy had said, her voice tight, as if afraid to say too much. Sunny's response was equally evasive. "It's above our heads. Whoopi, you know how it is." The more she heard, the more frustrated and isolated she felt. Was everyone in on something she didn't understand? Had she been blindsided by her own friends? The questions swirled in her mind, feeding the doubt and anger growing within her. Late one evening, Whoopi decided to pay a visit to the studio. It was after hours, and she figured she could sneak in, speak to someone, anyone, who might have the answer she desperately needed. She drove down to the building, her mind racing with possibilities. The lights were dim, and the halls echoed with emptiness as she walked in, her footsteps the only sound. Inside the control room, she found Gary, a producer she'd worked with for years. He looked up in surprise as she entered. "Whoopi, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice tense. "I need answers, Gary," she said, her tone firm, but with a tremor of desperation. "I know something's going on. I want to know why I was removed from the show." Gary hesitated, his face paling. "Whoopi, you don't know what you're asking. There are things bigger than you. You don't want to get involved in this." Her heart sank. Bigger than me? It was the first time she'd heard someone acknowledge the scale of whatever this was. But before she could press him further, Gary's phone buzzed and his expression turned cold. "I have to go. This conversation is over." Whoopi stood there, stunned. This wasn't just a corporate decision. Something darker was at play. She was standing on the edge of a cliff now, and though the wind was strong, she wasn't about to step back. But the more she pushed, the more walls seemed to rise around her. Self-doubt crept in as she walked away. Was she just chasing ghosts? Had she become too obsessed with something that wasn't meant to be uncovered? Her gut told her to keep going, but every step forward was met with resistance. The stakes were higher than she realized, and the path ahead was growing more treacherous by the minute. 2 days later, Whoopi found herself staring at a small stack of papers in her hand, a briefcase clutched in her other. She was sitting in her car outside a downtown office building, her nerves humming with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. A lead had finally emerged. It wasn't much, just a name, Martin Hughes, a high-level network executive. The kind of person Whoopi had never interacted with before, but someone whose name had come up in hushed conversations when she pushed people for answers. She'd learned from a contact at the network that Martin had been one of the key players, pushing for the change at The View. But his influence went beyond just a decision about the show. Word was that Hughes had been quietly making waves within the broader network, shifting the balance of power in ways no one had anticipated. And now, it seemed he had set his sights on Whoopi. Whoopi knew she had to confront him. She had to know. Why? Why her? Why now? Walking into the building, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her. This wasn't just a simple conversation anymore. This was a battle. She wasn't going to leave until she had answers. Inside, she was greeted by an assistant who led her through a sleek, modern lobby and into Martin Hughes's office. The man himself was seated behind a massive oak desk, his demeanor calm, almost too calm, as if the entire situation was beneath him. He was tall, with a perfectly tailored suit and a presence that seemed to fill the room. "Whoopi," he said, his voice cool and smooth. "I've been expecting you." The words sent a chill down her spine. There was something unsettling in the way he said it, like he had been orchestrating her every move for longer than she could have imagined. "You wanted to talk?" Whoopi asked, her voice steady but with an edge of accusation. "What's this all about?" Why was I removed from the show? Hughes leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together. It's not personal, Whoopi. You've been a great asset to the network, no doubt. But times are changing. The audience, well, let's just say they want something different now. There's a shift happening in the industry, and The View needs to evolve. Whoopi's blood began to boil. Evolve? You're telling me it's just about the audience? Or is it about you trying to control everything behind the scenes? Hughes didn't flinch. It's about power, Whoopi. A change in direction. You've been in this business long enough to understand how it works. You can either be part of the future or not. The word power hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating weight. But it wasn't just his words that left her reeling. It was the way he said it. There was something deeply personal in his tone, a level of calculation that sent a shiver through her. She was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about ratings or corporate strategies. This was about control, and she had been caught in the crossfire. But then, something shifted inside of her. The doubt, the uncertainty. She could feel them slipping away. Whoopi realized she wasn't just fighting for a spot on The View anymore. She was fighting for her dignity, for the truth. And she wasn't going to let someone like Martin Hughes take that from her. Not without a fight. You may think you've already won, Martin, Whoopi said, her voice growing more resolute. But I'm just getting started. As she stood up to leave, a sudden understanding washed over her. This wasn't just a battle for her career. It was a fight for something deeper, something she couldn't back down from. In that moment, Whoopi Goldberg made a decision. She wasn't going to just walk away. She was going to expose the truth, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. And whatever it took to bring that truth to light, she would do it, no matter the cost. The night before Whoopi was set to make her next move, she could barely sleep. The conversation with Martin Hughes had stirred something inside her, something fierce and unrelenting. His words echoed in her mind, but they no longer felt like threats. They felt like a challenge. She wasn't going to be silenced. Not this time. The following morning, she gathered everything she needed: files, recordings, and notes. Evidence she had quietly been gathering over the past few weeks. She had spoken to a few insiders, people who had been too afraid to speak up but were finally ready to talk. All of them confirmed the same thing. Martin Hughes was more than just an executive. He was a puppet master, pulling strings behind the scenes to reshape The View into something that catered to corporate interests. And Whoopi was in his way. As she arrived at the studio, the atmosphere felt different, heavier. The familiar faces of the crew avoided her gaze, and even her fellow hosts seemed on edge, not quite meeting her eyes. Whoopi knew that they were caught in a web of fear and manipulation. But that didn't matter anymore. It wasn't just about her. It was about the truth. She marched straight to the control room, where the producers were already gathered, preparing for the show's live broadcast. The cameras, the lights, the entire set. It all felt so surreal, like she was stepping into a place she no longer recognized. But this time, she wasn't there to play by the rules. Maria, the producer who had been the first to tell her about the break, was standing by the monitors when Whoopi entered. "What are you doing here?" Maria asked, her voice strained. "I'm here to take my seat back," Whoopi declared, her voice strong, unwavering. "And to make sure the world knows the truth about what's really happening." Before anyone could stop her, Whoopi walked onto the stage, the familiar set lights blinding her for a moment. She could feel her heartbeat thundering in her chest, but she had never been more certain of anything in her life. As the cameras began to roll, Whoopi took her place at the table, sitting down as if she'd never left. The other hosts, Joy, Sunny, Sarah, looked at her in shock, but it wasn't fear that shone in their eyes. It was confusion, as if they couldn't understand what had changed, but Whoopi didn't care. She knew what she had to do. "Welcome to The View," Whoopi said, her voice carrying through the studio like a force of nature. But today's episode is going to be a little different. Today, we're going to talk about what's really been happening behind the scenes at this show, about the people who've been pulling the strings and trying to control the narrative. And I'm going to make sure you all know the truth. The camera focused on her as she laid out everything: the names, the tactics, the corporate manipulation. She didn't hold back. Each revelation was like a bullet, sharp and precise, hitting the target with devastating accuracy. The room was still, silent, as Whoopi spoke. And in that silence, the power shifted. She could feel it. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to cut away, but it was too late. Whoopi's words had already been broadcast. The truth was out. There. No amount of manipulation could erase it. In that moment, Whoopi didn't just reclaim her seat. She reclaimed her voice. And for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was truly in control again. The storm was far from over, but she had started it, and there was no turning back now. The aftermath of Whoopi's bold move was nothing short of explosive. The world outside The View's polished set was shaken. News outlets, social media, and talk shows scrambled to cover the story. What had just unfolded on live television? What was Whoopi Goldberg's motive? Who were the people behind the scenes, manipulating everything? The questions were endless, and the answers, for the first time in a long while, felt within reach. Whoopi's decision to air everything on live television wasn't just a career-defining moment. It was a pivotal moment for her life. The network, furious but unable to undo what had been done, issued a statement hours later distancing themselves from her revelations. They tried to discredit her, called her actions irresponsible, and declared that The View was continuing on without her. But there was one thing they didn't count on: the public. The support she received was overwhelming. Fans rallied behind her, applauding her bravery for exposing the network's corruption. Online petitions were created, and soon, a hashtag, Justice for Whoopi, began trending. It wasn't just about a woman standing up for herself anymore. It was about the truth that had been buried for so long, about the manipulations the public had never seen. Whoopi had become more than a celebrity. She was a symbol of resistance against corporate greed, of someone who refused to be silenced. Within a few days, the pressure from both the public and media became too much for the network. They had underestimated Whoopi, thinking she was just another voice they could control. But in truth, she had become a force of nature. The network issued a formal apology, admitting to the undue influence of Martin Hughes and other executives behind the scenes. They also made a public offer to Whoopi, inviting her back to the show, on her terms. The shift had happened, and it wasn't just about getting her back. It was about restoring trust, rebuilding something real. Whoopi, however, didn't immediately accept their offer. She knew this moment wasn't just about her return to the View. It was about holding on to the integrity that she had fought for, about proving that her voice couldn't be stifled by a network or an individual. It was a reminder that sometimes the hardest fights are the ones that take everything from you, and that the victory doesn't always come from returning to where you started. She took a few days to reflect, surrounded by friends and family, who had supported her throughout the ordeal. "You did it," Joy said, her voice full of pride. "You got the truth out there, and you didn't let them break you." Whoopi smiled, but there was something more in her eyes. "I didn't do it alone. It's all of us, Joy. This isn't just my fight. It's for everyone who's been silenced, for everyone who's been told they're not enough. This is bigger than just me. We've got to make sure the voices that matter are heard, no matter the cost." The following week, Whoopi made her decision. She accepted the network's offer, but with a condition. She would be back, but only if there was a complete overhaul of how the show operated. The View would no longer be a playground for executives to manipulate. It would be a place for authentic conversations, for real voices to be heard, and Whoopi would be there to make sure of it. The truth had set her free, but it had also given her the power to change the very foundation of a show she had once been a part of, but never fully controlled. In the months that followed, the show was indeed reshaped. Whoopi took on a more influential role, and the network was forced to reconsider its approach to not just The View, but its entire lineup of programming. The shifts in the industry were undeniable, and Whoopi's fight had sparked a broader movement. Behind the scenes, things were never the same. As Whoopi sat back down at the table with her co-hosts once again, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment. The fight hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over, but Whoopi had done what she had set out to do. She had reclaimed her voice, and in doing so, she had reminded the world that no matter how many walls they try to build, the truth always has a way of breaking through. And as the cameras rolled once more, She leaned forward, a knowing smile on her lips. "Let's talk about what really matters today," she said. "The world is watching." And for the first time in a long time, Whoopi knew without a doubt that she was in the right place, her place.